book. And I've done a lot of work over the years with OAFM, and it's really nice to have this particular opportunity. And what we're going to do here in just a moment is give you sort of an overview of the book and talk a little bit more about some specific elements to it, in it. And we'll try to make some specific applications of this to family work as well, but it certainly is relevant to what's happening in our world today. So we are happy to talk about the larger scope pictures of that as well. And Jackie, do you want to say anything to start out with?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here. And thanks for the great introduction and welcoming, Marianne. And we're looking forward to sharing our book with all of you.
Okay, well, do you want to go to our next slide, our first slide? So how did we get to write this book? We have both long been concerned about a kind of overly naive, if you want to think of it that way, view that people from our field sometimes have to how serious conflict gets resolved, and to how social change happens. And one of the things that I have often thought about that is missing is the idea that part of change is conflict escalation sometimes, and is creating the forces that are going to induce the systems around which conflict occurs or within which conflict occurs to change. And so a kind of a practical and inspiring at the same time approach to this comes from one of the heroes of the US civil rights movement, John Lewis, who was also a US congressman, who's famous for having said, never ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And in a way, the very specific impetus for writing this book for the two of us happened after the George Floyd murder in the US, in Minnesota, when there was quite a bit of building of a social movement for changing how police view people of color, communities of color. And almost immediately, quite a few people in the conflict field said, oh, look, what we really need to do is to bring people together. We need to bring people together, to the police and the community, to talk and to try to resolve their differences. And I thought at that time, well, that may be true that needs to happen, but it's really only half the story. And what it doesn't really look at is how hard it is to have change occur, and about the power relationships in that system. And so that sometimes what really needs to happen often is that you need to equally attend to getting into good trouble, to getting into building a movement or building the forces for change. And then the connection part makes sense. So that I've often thought myself about what would have happened if it was 1956 and it was Montgomery, Alabama, and Rosa Parks had sat in the front of the bus, got arrested, and a bunch of mediators went down there to right away try to settle that individual dispute. And it would not have been the right thing. She would have been negotiating from a position of lack of power. And furthermore, the community would have been negotiating from a relative lack of power. So instead, what happened was there was a movement that developed over time, over a year, a bus boycott. Martin Luther King came to the prominence through that. There was some legal action. There was a lot of publicity and attention. And a year later, then, in fact, the end of it was sort of mediated by the churches of Montgomery, but on very different terms it would have been otherwise. So that's kind of an inspiration for why we wrote it. And I just want to say one thing about this in a family context. I think if you look at the history of what happened in divorce in family relationships, there are times when trying to mediate would have automatically have meant that the father would have gotten everything because they were in the power position. And later times where would have been an assumption the mother would get um, automatically be presumptive for getting custody of children. And we can look at similar dynamics that have happened over time with how we looked at domestic violence, how we've looked at division of property, how we've looked at the access of grandparents to children, how we've looked at the role of extended family or of tribal communities. And so I think it's important that it's not, we're not just talking about something that's abstract to large conflicts or reserved for large conflicts. It affects almost every single kind of conflict that we get into that is intense and that is based in a background of where there are differential power relationships. Jackie?
Yeah, thank you, Bernie. Can you go to the next slide, actually, and I'll build on that as we discuss the next one. Thank you. So again, building on what Bernie said, here are also, here's John Lewis's full quote, and also Ella Baker, who was a woman who was instrumental and crucial to the movement here for civil rights in the US. And so for me also, in addition to what Bernie said, one of the things that attracted me and that we were really trying to get across in the book, how the individual was kind of connected to the more systemic, larger changes. And I think, again, family is a perfect explanation of that, and how some people are oppressed and some are not. And even in those positions where historically men have had more power, we see how even within mediations and custody issues, it kind of flips. And the essentialization of woman and her role as a caretaker usually ends up discriminating against men who actually historically have been deprived of being the main caretakers if when there's a divorce, the child is an infant or young. And so how can those systems change and shift? We need to address the individual issues that happen usually, for example, in a mediation table or negotiation, but that in order to make some really systemic, impactful change, that in order for those who have been historically oppressed to have a chance to even just be heard, we need to disrupt, but we also need to make those connections at the personal, interpersonal level. And so one of the things in the field that has always sort of bothered me a little bit has been how as a mediator, and when I was doing my mediation training decades ago, there was an emphasis almost at the exclusion of systemic forces of oppression that were influencing the dynamic that was happening at the mediation table, and how by just focusing on the individual components of it also, in many ways, we were sustaining a status quo and keeping on those who were being oppressed by whatever system or dynamics, whether it was a labor employment relationship kind of mediation for employment rights, whether it was a custody issues, like in the case of family mediation, or whether it was in a like healthcare context, which I did a lot of like medical malpractice mediations, that disconnect from what was influencing at the mediation, those external factors that were happening that were driving the conflict, were usually even encouraged, or we were told early on in our trainings that we really needed to focus on the two people at the table and not focus on the past and kind of move on the present to the history. And so for me, it is very hard for change to actually happen that way. I thought that I was perpetuating the status quo if I were going to do that. And so that was a big driver and motivator for me in terms of what we wanted to get across and accomplish with the book. So I think that next slide, I can remember. Yeah, so Bernie, you want to take it now?
Well, let's talk a little bit about the whole concept of the neutrality trap itself. What do we mean by the neutrality trap? You know, our field, particularly the field of mediation facilitation, has grown up with that as saying that we're third-party neutrals is a central identity, a central way we present ourselves. Who are we? we're third-party neutrals who are going to, we don't have a stake in the outcome. We're just here to help other people work out whatever they want. But there's a problem with that. One of the problems with it, actually, there's several problems with it. One problem with it is nobody really knows what we mean by neutrality. It is a very amorphous term. And, doesn't mean we are structurally neutral. I mean, we don't have any connection with that makes us more aligned with one party or the other. Well, I think it's remarkably difficult to argue that often is ever really the case. I mean, if I am a male mediating a case between a man and a woman, there's a structural way in which I'm not. I'm more identified, not necessarily emotionally or personally, but structurally with a male. As just a simple example of that, we often say, well, we're not really neutral, we're impartial. We don't really, we don't have a really a connection, or we're not partial to one side or the other. But everyone on this call who's mediated a number of cases knows sometimes you kind of find one side a lot more appealing than the other, or a lot more reasonable, or a lot easier to work with than the other. And we could go on down through all the different ways neutrality means something. And it's a very confusing term, and I don't think we need it. The trap of neutrality is that it assumes an totally equal power relationships, because if they're not, and they never are in serious disputes, but if they're not totally equal, really trying to be whatever we mean by neutral, totally even-handed, means the more powerful person's going to dominate. And to give an example of this from work I did in child protection mediation, which I know many of you have worked with, if you really are going to be totally neutral, and you have on one side parents who are accused of neglect, let's say, and can they have what role can they have in decision making? On the other side, you have a bunch of professionals, even if they're diverse in terms of their ethnic background, for example, but they're all professionals familiar with the system, very likely to have a lot of connection with each other, very likely to have been through a number of similar processes before, knowing the language. And you have the parent on the other side. This is not a place in which formal neutrality makes sense. This is a time at which we have to take an active role to try to help empower the party who is the less powerful. And I think we all know that. So what do people want from us if neutrality isn't what we really offer? Well, I think they want from us a process that helps everybody have a powerful role. I think they want for us to genuinely have concerns for everybody we're working with. I think they want us to be authentic and transparent, but they don't want us to fall. We don't want us to just fall into doing nothing. And when you're dealing with bigger social issues, being neutral in the face of racism, oppression, environmental depredation, that's a very difficult thing to do. It doesn't mean we cannot play a role where our primary focus is on process and on helping people communicate, but it does mean that we have to avoid the trap that we get into by thinking that all we need is to bring people together and everything will be all right. So that I've often said that the theme, this shows my age, but that the theme song for our field ought not to be, come on, people, now smile on your brother, everybody get together, got to love one another right now. Not a bad sentiment. Doesn't work if there's situations of inequality and oppression. And I think it's a very important reality for our field and others too, to come face to face with. I think it's a foundational question for those of us who do this kind of work. And so I'll say, so the subtitle of the book is Disrupting and Connecting, because we do believe connection is an important part of how change happens, but so is disruption. And if you think of change, of social change, of movements for change, and of deep personal change we've gone through too, there's always been disruption that's been a part of it. And, we can think of disruption in two different ways. We can think of it as chaotic disruption, and where it's not planned, it's unpredictable, it feels slightly out of control, sometimes it borders on violence. And then we can think of strategic disruption, which is the kind that's more planned for the long-term social change efforts. It's what we think about, I think, usually with different disciplined nonviolent approaches to social change, such as in this civil rights movement. And we can also understand that in many ways, we would prefer that because it's less out of control, but chaotic disruption is often critical too. It provides the energy and the momentum, I think, that longer-term efforts and commitment strategies build off of. And I think that was true in the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, for the Me Too movement, the Time's Up movement, etc. We certainly in Ontario have had some recent dramatic examples of chaotic disruption, with the truckers occupying Ottawa and blocking the Ambassador Bridge right down the road from me. And I didn't agree with what they were calling for personally at all. Although I thought they were tapping into something that a lot more people felt than those who simply agreed with their particular actions. But it's a really interesting example of both the power of unplanned and slightly out of control disruption, although it was more planned now, we know now than we thought, but also the limits, because if you don't make the transition from a more spontaneous, chaotic, immediate approach to disruption to a more longer-term plan, then you don't really build the social movements or the social forces for change. And in a way, you can see that we enter people's lives after which they've experienced often a very chaotic disruption. And we know that they're going to be going through a long-term change effort. And we shouldn't think that means disruption is going to end, but we're trying to help them move from a more chaotic to a less chaotic stage of it. So Jackie, you want to maybe talk us through the next intersectionality and the next slide?
Yep. So I'll go to so the other piece that is really important when you're trying to impact and affect change is the concept of intersectionality. And at least here in the United States, and I think overall, but specifically in the US, there's been such a shift in terms of our census bureau where the white are no longer going to be a majority in terms of population and numbers. And so there's starting to be a shift where the minoritized or underrepresented groups or BIPOCs, Black, Indigenous, people of color, are actually going to be more than the white people. And so that has created all sorts of tensions, and we've certainly saw that played out with the elections during the Trump first term election when he ran for president for the first time, and it continues to play out. And so what does it mean then for us to try to impact change where there's all this power differences at different intersections depending on who we are, right? So, and we also saw this played out with the feminist movement in the US, where the Black women were saying, you don't really get us when you are actually advocating for women's rights. Your experiences as a white woman are different at many levels than the experiences of women who were Black. And then there were the Black queer women saying, well, and we have another added layer of intersection here because they were Black, they were queer, and they were women. And so you start seeing all of this intersectionalities played out and how all those power forces start uniting or splitting. And we need to find ways to start collaborating and organizing, not only from within our own individual affinity groups, but also across the different affinity groups, some of them who may be more clearly seen than others. And so what does it mean when we're bringing together different people from different identities to impact change? And how within even those movements, we know that they're not homogeneous, and that many times the first instinct is to say, let's just forget about this conflict, or let's put it aside so that we can see our end goal happen, and how that in itself is also unproductive in order to really be able to organize and to truly be able to affect change and have a more strategic disruption, the kind that Bernie was talking about. Otherwise, you have within your own systems sort of like a mini chaos going on that actually impacts the way you're self-organizing within that particular movement. And so for us to be able to look as to how we're going to start organizing moving forward, when the shifts in population are so real, and we are surrounded and with people trying to advance a goal that we have so many different worldviews and visions and lived experiences, we know that there's power in that, but we also know that conflict tends to exacerbate. And so the idea, again, of falling into that neutrality trap or trying to just talk things out or suppress them or be neutral or be objective is not going to work, but it's going to hinder our ability to move forward and impact change. And I think we talked about good trouble already. So can we just go to the next slide, please? And so I think, Bernie, you also alluded to this already. If not neutrality and facilitated, what do we bring to the table? And I would add to what Bernie had mentioned in terms of transparency and authenticity. I think we also have the capacity as mediators to bridge the individual issues and the individual conflicts at the more personal level with the more systemic levels of conflict. And so when I think about mediation, for example, in the family context, right, I see how mediators could have a role that goes beyond just focusing on the individual conflict of alimony or custody or rights of the different of both parties, but how is that conflict being influenced by our system, that the patriarchy system we live on? How is it influenced by misogynistic attitudes that may be embedded within and are embedded many times within our legal systems? And so we bring to the table the capacity to be able to bridge those two things together while interacting with people at the individual level. And in many ways, I like to see that as planting a seed. Can I plant a seed that gets people thinking about how the conflict they're having right now that seems very individual, and alimony, like who gives money, how much, visitation rights, how even those conflicts are being driven by the society we live in, the context we live in, the laws that are in place, some of them, like I said, favoring man and not woman, other favoring woman. If we can plant those seeds and start people questioning about that, could there be the possibility of them not only reaching an agreement, but being themselves agents of change as they step out of our mediation table? So trying to look at mediation not only as an individual intervention, but as having a broader impact potentially, depending on how we decide to deal with that mediation and how we decide to not be neutral, to not be fully objective, and to allow for those spaces of disruption to happen and even flourish and even escalate the conflict a little bit at different points in time. And so can we, the next slide, I think, let's see. Yeah, and so this is just an overview of the chapters of and the sections in which we have divided our book, just to give you an idea if you haven't read it or haven't had a chance to buy it yet. We basically divided in three major areas. How do we engage with conflict? How do we deepen the conflict? We believe that that is part of the neutrality trap, our impulse to immediately go in, engage with the conflict, have conversations, and either try to solve it immediately or just try to suppress it. That doesn't allow us to deepen the conflict enough. So then we go into the deepening conflict, and then how do we move from the chaotic disruption that emerges, that surface, that it's necessary to make some change, but how do we move from that to strategic disruption? Next slide. And this is finally, Bernie and I will be teaching a 5-day 2-credit course, intensive between June 6 and 10 at the Shenandoah Valley here at Harrison, Virginia at Eastern Mennonite University. And so we will be covering obviously this topic a lot more in depth. Bernie, anything to add?
Could I go back just for one moment to
One
the
slide.
previous slide? I just wanted to say something about the two chapters in the deepening conflict thing, because
Hmm.
I think they're very important to the work we do with families. One of them, which builds off, some of you may be familiar with the book I wrote a while back called Staying with Conflict, is that in order to really understand this, we have to look at the kind of conflict that does not lend itself to a nice, neat resolution, which I think is most important conflicts, where there's at least an element to them that can go on for a long time. And certainly that's true in many, many divorces, certainly in high conflict divorces, but in even ones that aren't so high conflict. And so part of the challenge is, how do we engage with the conflict without really focusing just on what solutions are there? And the other one, beyond stupid, crazy, and evil, it's something I've said often to students over the years and to myself. I'm as good as the next person. And so Jackie and I have done this with each other often, of trying to figure out what's going on by thinking about how stupid or crazy or evil could somebody like Vladimir Putin, or from my perspective, Donald Trump, be. Or in a family situation, somebody who just seems like they're acting in a horrible way. It's easy to focus it all on their these kind of characteristics. And there's nothing wrong with spending some time trying to understand, as long as we also acknowledge our limits of genuinely being able to understand people. But we also have to understand that explain what's going on if we do not have a understanding of the systemic structural setting from which in these conflicts arise, which in cases of social conflict are often systems of privilege and oppression. So I just wanted to maybe amplify that a little bit. And then I think, unless there's something else you wanted to add to that, Jackie, we would like to open this up for questions, comments, discussions, reactions.
Very nice. Thank you so much. I know there is going to be quite a few questions, and I think we could use the chat box, or if you put your hand up, I could call on you and we could interact that way. It's quite a large group. I think we can manage it though. Well, everyone here knows that I will have questions. So if you would like to ask them, you can put them in the chat, and I'll get us started off here. The title of your book, The Neutrality Trap, Bernie and Jackie, where, I wrote down a few things thinking about the neutrality is the possibility of falling into do nothing. And I really liked that, when I'm envisioning sort of mediating and putting on that neutrality hat and trying to approach families with neutrality, the danger of being in a place where you don't do anything is actually, it goes against how I feel about servicing families and helping families through things. And at the same time, I'm sure a number of us are thinking about our standards of practice, which we all know off by heart. And we're thinking we want to stay in line with those. Can you comment a little bit about what the neutrality trap is and how you think it intersects with our responsibilities as mediators to families?
Well, I actually, I actually have something to say, and I'm sure Bernie does as well. So I'll start and then pass it over to Bernie. I think part of the problem precisely stems from our professional rules of conduct many times, and I think we have not only mediators, but mediators, journalism, lawyers. I mean, I'm a lawyer as well, and I know how those professional conducts also many times they're built to preserve a status quo that I don't think it's serving the population and the shifts and the world we live in the 21st century. And I think most of these professional conducts are framed and are written within a very specific framework, which is not only to maintain the status quo, but mostly written by people who are in positions of privilege and very rarely diverse. I think at least in the US, I know the professional conducts that that are for mediators generally stem from, an association from ACR, American Bar Association, their section of dispute resolution, and family mediators. And we know that those groups, at least here at the beginning, were mostly white cisgender male with a few white females on board. So to begin with, many of these professional conducts are not even reflective or have taken into consideration other voices. And so I think we should take a step back and even start questioning, are those professional conducts and standards of conduct appropriate for the times we're living in right now? Not to say that, all of them need to be thrown away and start all over, but some of them may, I don't know. They are certainly not built with people like me in mind, like Latinx, by African Americans, by queer, LGBTQ plus people. They're built with a very specific population. And so who decides, for example, that there's a professional attire to be wear or a way to wear your hair that doesn't really fit if you're an African American woman? So who decides all of this? So I think my invitation would be to say, well, yes, we have some professional conducts. We do owe a responsibility to the clients we are serving. We're there to serve them. But are these processes really designed to serve all of them? Or are they really designed to just serve a group of them? Because we just don't know what we don't know. And the people that were at the table designing all of this, we know that there wasn't representation from all areas of who our clients are going to be in the future. So that's kind of a little bit of my thoughts on that. Bernie, you want to?
Well, I agree with all of that. But let me just say maybe a confession. When I was on the board of the Association of Conflict Resolution and they started talking about their standards of professional practice, I always wanted to leave the room. Because first of all, I thought so much of it was about protecting the professional, not protecting the public. Mm-hmm. And that so much of it was also about marketing and not about genuinely being clear about what our real values and ethics are that we want to declare. I think they're valuable, and I happen to know a little bit about OAFM. I know some of your standards of practice, and they're excellent. It's not that, but it's sometimes they're short-sighted. Not yours, but in general they're short-sighted, and maybe yours are too, and they do need to be revisited. The other thing I think about is that what is the essence of what we're saying in standards of practice? I think the essence of what we're saying is we are who we say we are. We will be who we will do what we say we will do. And that means we need to be transparent. And neutrality is a way of hiding who we are, not being who we are. So I would encourage people to think about different kind of language, more along the lines of we are not committed to not intentionally advancing one party's interests at the expense of the other, but to be clear about where we thought there were serious interests that weren't being taken into account. We need to say what we think about power relations and where we will be with that. I think it's saying too much. We're going to be neutral. We're going to be impartial. We're going to be omnipartial. We're going to be multi-partial. We're going to be unbiased. That's performative. That's not really about what we do and how we help people, is my personal view on that.
It's really helpful, I'm sure, for me personally, and for a lot of us. I think it's just getting there, and you've made me think that, I'm very proud of OAFM standards of practice, and I do think that we have pieces in there that speak to some of the items you're saying, and I think that we can have another look and see where else we could be expansive. There's a really good question from Christine. How do we encourage those who have been privileged by existing systems of favor to be expansive and accepting of change that could diminish their favor? Any tricks? It's a great question.
Well, here's a baseline. I mean, I certainly think trying to connect with them and help them think through what their values are and how they play out and create the personal relationships and have people storytelling across different groups all help. But I will say this, I don't think change happens because of the altruism of the powerful. I think, the change happens because the way closes behind. There's a Quaker saying that progress occurs as the way closes behind. It's because people organize for change, because people insist on it, because people demand it. And then people in positions of power, position to make change happen, will begin to take notice, and they will begin to, those with, some of them anyhow, will let the better angels of their nature come forward, and they can become allies, and we can connect with them. But I just think, independent of building movements for change or stories for change, it's very hard to get change to happen just by the goodwill of those in power. Now, we've seen some wonderful examples of change happening, and you can look at that's what's happened, for example, with the right to marriage, or the marriage equality, or with the Me Too movement, or with Black Lives Matter, where I think they have had an impact on people of power, primarily though because there was a movement connected with them, and because people told their stories in a very powerful way, and we can help that happen.
Mm. I makes me think of something you said that I wrote down about chaotic disruption brings energy and momentum to a cause. And I think that is, I think what you're speaking of, right, is this that sometimes we need this a little bit of chaos to affect change. Another good question here, in a quizzical one: where in the George Floyd matter would we possibly see the neutrality trap manifest?
Well, after the George Floyd happened, and there were very angry demonstrations sometimes, and sometimes there was some vandalism around the edges of it. There were all sorts of people just saying, let's bring the community and the police together. Let's stop this. Please stop this. And I thought that was often premature. Another example of that is when people started saying, defund the police. There was an awful lot. No, we can't do that. And rather than saying, what is the message behind the defund the police, and appreciate that and go with that. And the message behind it was, the system isn't working. And instead of saying, oh, no, we're not going to defund the police. Well, we're going to have police. I don't think anybody ever thought we weren't going to have police forces, but they were saying structural change needs to happen. And that was something that I thought we saw people falling into the trap of not recognizing how important that was and how motivating that slogan was, because it spoke to people's sense of the system not working.
And I think I would add also, we saw it also as well in the way that anger was defined or framed as something that was not helpful, and these are just angry people going out there and manifesting, without acknowledging the power of that emotion. Because I think through that anger, you can actually move people towards becoming indignant towards a situation. And we're so quick within certainly the US cultural context to immediately say, oh, anger is a bad thing. We need to be about peace. We need to be about dialogue. We need to be about conversation. We need to just sit together and talk it out. And in many ways, minimizing the power of anger and accepting it and normalizing as something that is what people are authentically experiencing. It's anger because century after century after century, African Americans have been and continue to be exploited in so many ways, is another way where I felt we fell into that neutrality trap.
Thank you so much. Sama, I'm asking you to unmute so you can ask your question.
Hi, yeah. When I was thinking about what you guys were talking about in terms of the George Floyd matter, it kind of brought me back to the historical injustices that occurred in the US and how the government was trying to play this narrative of the neutrality trap of, in order for you to enact change, you have to go through the super peaceful route. And you can see that through the difference the government has, their stance on, say, the dichotomy between Martin Luther King Jr. versus Malcolm X. I'm not trying to say one's right or the other, But it's just interesting to see how, the government tries to portray that, you can get whatever you want as long as you go through it through a really peaceful manner, when in reality, like, that change isn't occurring. Or how far into the future since that time. And, that peaceful route still hasn't done really much. So I think it's really telling to see how this is played into the past, because it really is indicative of, the present day.
Yeah, can I just thank you very much for that, because I agree with that. But I also want to say it's also true in Canada.
Mhm.
You look at the whole native schools issue, for example, or I never pronounced the name of the tribe. And I'm going to try to pronounce it. I'll butcher it. The Native American group has been the First Nations group. I'm a dual citizen, and my mind goes. But the First Nations group who blocked the pipeline. The different responses that we've had to that. I think that's important.
I think that, and that's another area, and thank you so much for your comments. I think they really captured a really good example of the neutrality trap, because embedded within your comment and question are also, once again, the focus on the present and moving forward, like wiping out a complete history. And there's actually quite a few studies and research done, but that when you do that, it's the people that are the less privileged and the ones that are disempowered that actually have the more to lose, because the systems have historically worked for them. And so another way is not only to, like you very eloquently stated, kind of like moving people into, you follow this process, that it's our process. And we all know how well that went for not only First Nation groups, but also here in the United States for indigenous population, by following the treaties that were never, that they signed and were never honored, and on it goes. So I think it's not only that, but is that movement towards trying, we have it here with the whole debate right now about CRT and critical race theory, right? Like, that's, the history is kind of not important. Let's just focus on what's happening on and kind of move forward. So it's really everywhere. I mean, this trap because that's how the system perpetuates itself and replicates its rules and regulations for everyone.
Nice. And someone in the chat wrote the name Wet'suwet'en. Is that correct?
It's
Yeah.
Wedham.
Okay.
I'm very sorry. I don't feel good about the fact that I keep thinking I have it nailed and then I don't.
And thank you to Enza. Our mediators are often wanting sort of steps, like we're always looking for concrete ways to address something. And this question sort of speaks to that, about what are some steps we can take to ensure other people's voices are heard in the mediation room? What can we do?
Well, if we're not actively committed to that, then what are we doing? I mean, and the thing that I think we have to understand is our own blind spots. That we think, men think that if 20% of the time women are speaking, then they're speaking too much often. I mean, just at least subconsciously. And I think it's really important that some of that starts with our looking at ourselves. But I think one of the most important ways in reality as a mediator that I've not been neutral is I've often very much used my thing to get the voice onto the table of somebody who naturally wouldn't have put it on there as much or as loudly or as clearly as they might have. And there are all sorts of techniques we can do for that, but it starts with a commitment and awareness of the many different ways that people don't do it. Now, one of the things that it's interesting in is that cultural approaches to communication are some are much more compatible with the underlying presumptions of mediation than others. As an example, we often say, well, just tell us what you're concerned about and we'll try to figure out what's a good solution. Well, that doesn't sometimes work with certain cultural groups because it's way too personal. And it takes a lot of trust in the person, and it takes them being with somebody who isn't neutral for them to really be comfortable in doing that. So to me, we need to look at the very structure of how we do our processes. And that's why storytelling is so powerful, because oftentimes most cultures have approaches for how people will share their stories. And I think we need to be open to and actively courting different approaches with a particular eye to the power differentials.
I think I would add to that also. A lot of my work has been also with colonialism and in the Caribbean area. And there's this great philosopher and scholar from Martinique, Edward Glissant, who has the concept of what he calls the right to opacity. And that is the right to not be understood. And I think sometimes as mediators, we use too much the let's try and understand each other, almost sometimes as a cop-out, as a rule, to say, well, I can't really fully solve the issue or engage with the issue or advance the situation until I fully understand, until I fully put myself in someone else's position. And I don't think that's ever possible. And so I think some of the things that we can do as mediators is sort of come to terms with the fact that I may never understand where you're coming from. I may understand a little bit, maybe none at all, but that should not be an impediment to try to sit down and try to reach either an agreement or a disruption or a connecting between those people, those individuals. And so I really always, as someone that is from an underrepresented group here in the US, get really frankly quite annoyed when people sometimes spend so much time, and I know it stems many times from a well-intended place, right? Truly, really trying to understand, but how much do you really need to understand, right? How much will you be able to? Can we just try to figure out how to work with this problem, stay with the conflict, like Bernie has written on many occasions, and stay with it in ways that are constructive, productive. Maybe there's a resolution, maybe there isn't, but just stop trying to understand me, right? So I think we use that sometimes as a way of shielding ourselves from the conflict and trying to be neutral. And it makes us feel good because we're trying to do something. We're trying to understand when you're really never going to understand each other. The second thing that always comes to an attention is, for me, there's a big difference between cross-cultural communication, cross-cultural attempts to understand each other and worldviews. That in itself is never going to make the structural system changes that we're talking about. I think our emphasis sometimes on cross-cultural communication and how different people communicate and engage with each other is an important part. I'm not saying that we should not learn how to do that or be dismissive, but we should not think by 1 second that that's what's actually going to change the system. All that does is it gets us closer to knowing that there's someone else that has a different worldview than we do, a different lived experience, and therefore we're not going to see eye to eye to many things. But in order to really make the systemic changes, in order to really make the structural changes at level of policy, of professional conduct, of legal rules and regulations that are out there, we need to go past that. We need to start understanding the how and the why these individual interactions that we have actually are sustaining the systems of oppression. How do microaggressions on a day-to-day basis, for example, are the ways of normalizing that someone is particularly inferior or less than, and therefore we create all sorts of policy and norms and professional conducts that make it all the way to the legal system sometimes that actually are enforcing violence. I think that is the connection, and we sometimes, because we stay so much at this individual level of trying to understand, we kind of like miss that. And so I think that just trying to be aware of that blind spot of what am I really engaging with here.
I'm thinking sort of in the moment when we're mediating, and I'm imagining sort of mediating in a different way for a minute, right? It's thinking about my neutrality and how I present myself. And I hope that others may feel the same way. If not, I'm outing myself as thinking, what if my client says, "Oh, you're not being neutral, right? You're biased," and what happens then? And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. If anyone else feels a similar way, it maybe pop a thumbs up if you're thinking about that too. In the realm of our jobs, what happens then? Because this is a question, and this is a common complaint that we hear at OEFM is the mediator was biased, the mediator was not neutral. And it being in our standards of practice makes it an enforceable caution with potential action. So do we strategically disrupt in some way? How do we go about that?
Well, you might want to look at your standards of practice, as I said earlier, but
Yeah.
When it happens, and it's happened to all of us, you're not being neutral, you're biased, you're on their side, no, I'm on no one's side, I'm absolutely not. That doesn't work. I think what usually almost always works is to, not almost, maybe not always, but most often, is to ask them, all right, tell me more. What is it that has been happening that's not working for you? What can I do that'll help this work better for you? In terms of, if somebody says, well, you're not supposed to take sides, you're not supposed to say, I never said that my role and my understanding of it was that I would never make observations or comments or set some boundaries here or put some things on the table that I think you need to consider or respect. But I think it doesn't help very much to get into a power struggle around it. It helps. That's my own thinking about it. But if pushed to the wall, that's what I might say. But much more likely, what I'm just simply going to say, I want this to work for you. My commitment is to make this work for both of you. So let me figure out what's not working and how I can understand it and do something about it.
Nice. Okay.
I saw a comment that from Chris Arnold. Hi, Chris.
Yes.
That I was about to say. So I recommend it to people, which is that we need to understand about this issue of making ourselves understood, of how do you of the person who's the target of I want to understand you better. That is actually putting an emotional burden on. Mm-hmm. And if you put that on top of the fact of power differences, of race differences, of oppression, that can be a very intense, way too often felt power. The burden of understanding cannot be put on the person we're trying to understand. And I think, by the way, somebody used to be a therapist. That's true in therapy too. Your job isn't to say you have to explain everything to me as a therapist. It's to say, tell me what you want to know. Tell me your story. I will ask you questions. You help me do that. But it's my job to try to figure out how we move forward, how we help you move forward with what you want to work on here. So I don't think it's just in mediation that this happens. And I think it's true in law. It's true in if somebody comes to your house because they want to do an architectural design on it. There has to be a different kind of reciprocity there.
Yeah, and I think part of what gets us into that trap is not feeling comfortable with naming power differentials at a table, and somehow thinking that we can level or control the power, that illusion that we can come in and mediate and control those power imbalances. And I think there is power actually to naming that and letting our clients know that there will be moments where there are going to be power imbalances, and that is part of your role, to name that, to not be neutral when those situations of power imbalances are coming at a cost, when one voice is being silenced and the other isn't. And so I think in many ways, when you look at the many of the agreements to mediate, for example, comes to memory now, which I haven't seen any of them lately, but those agreements that EOC used to have and all those templates and all of those language. And I think we've come a long ways from those days. I just think we have a long more way to go. That concept that we can somehow manage and control this and yet not name it. And so I think that gives us a way, when you are in the mediation table, if you have had prior to the mediation conversations about your role in addressing issues of power imbalances, not to suppress them or control them, but to naming and checking in if what is working for the parties, I think that's a way to sort of preempt when the problem comes. In many ways, you have already set yourself and your clients up for success to have a process that will not ignore that. And I think sometimes we don't do. I know, speaking from experiences, I know that sometimes in the past I had not done that effectively. And then when the time comes, that's what gets you into that so uncomfortable situation.
Mhm.
And I think someone had asked about the name of the
Yeah,
Martinique
thank you.
poet, and I wrote it down on the in the chat. So in case
Yeah,
someone,
some Martinique philosopher and
yeah,
prominent
you can
poet.
cut and paste that there if I just
Yeah,
wrote
right
it.
to opacity. I think that's a really interesting concept, right? And again, it sort of it sort of butts against what you know, how I would normally approach something, right? I you know, even in teaching mediation, I talk to my students about really showing up and being there and trying to create rapport and relationship and how important that is. And you know, I'm teaching this weekend, and I think, you know, what about having a read through this and thinking about also this, it's the right to opacity, almost akin to privacy. I think, you know, that it doesn't have to be the entire story that is revealed, and some parts can stay separate and apart from the mediation. That could be okay. It's
It's also the rights of boundaries, you know, and it's something that every parent has to learn. That you can't ever completely understand your kids, so and they have a right for you not to.
yeah. That's
It just
yeah.
becomes it becomes an excuse sometimes to not advance social justice, which I think should be at the core. And I think it's at the core of one of the reasons that many mediators and many people go into the field of mediation, right? Is to provide a service. It's to advance social justice or justice for particular individuals or parties that have not been able to achieve it in their own because of everything that's surrounding them and the conflict that they're in. And I also think, specifically in the case of the US, and because the mediation models that were developed in the US became so spread all over the world, right? Not only in the US, but certainly Canada. And I think one thing we forget is because the US has never seen themselves as an empire. They've seen themselves as someone who advances democracy. And the imperialistic way of thinking that is embedded within the US scholars, professionals, and many folks, that imperialistic way of thinking it makes its way through our models and processes of mediation. And so to what extent then it's our role to say these are things that are really, really good. These things we need to question, like why this way, how, why. And sometimes these models are just kind of taken for granted and we just use them because they're helpful in certain areas. But there's a certain underlying framework there that it is disempowering. And I always think as a person from Puerto Rico, how a lot of the things that are embedded in those models, like neutrality is one of them that never quite resonated, because communities that are more relationship based, it doesn't really matter how much of an expert you are, you're looking for the relational connection, right? And how the whole concept of speaking one person at a time never made sense to me and never will, because that's now how we roll. And so in many ways, and that's where I'm talking about this imperialistic, well, it has to be my way because this is how it works, right? One person speaks at a time, one person process at a time. And so when you start looking at all of these different rules that are embedded within our processes of mediation, of facilitation, of dialogue, we need to take a step back and see, how are those rules even embedded within our processes, suppressing people's voices and really moving us forward to change the status quo, whether for that family, which is a system, whether for this group of people in an employment setting or in a family law or any other place.
Wow. It makes me think of a button I had as a kid, a punk rock kid in the early 80s. The button was question authority.
Yes.
And it really made me think of that. Thank you so much, Jackie and Bernie, for spending this hour with us. I think we could go on for hours more. Wonderful comments thanking you in the chat. I hope that you have a chance to go and get Jackie and Bernie's book, and I'm certainly going to go out and do that myself. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we will talk to you again next time on Mediation Matters. Thanks very much, Bernie and Jackie.
And thank you very much. We really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for the invitation.
And anybody's welcome to email us if they had questions with it too.
Oh, very nice. Okay, you can email me and I'll pass them on if you don't have their addresses. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.